Hey everyone, it's Dr. Marcon, and we are going to be talking about the human cardiovascular system. So what is the #1 killer of men and women in the US and developed world? Is it cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, or I have no idea? Well, guys, it is heart disease. This week's learning objectives, we are going to ask ourselves, what are the organs of the cardiovascular system, and how does blood flow through them? We're going to explain why different blood vessels are built the way they are. We're going to solve case studies related to coronary cardiovascular disease and describe how blood pressure relates to the cardiac cycle. Now, why do we as humans need circulation? So as humans, as organisms, we get our energy by eating. The sugars in our food are broken down, and the waste products include carbon dioxide. Now, this process is assisted by oxygen, and a byproduct of that process is water, H2O. We know that circulation is needed for materials to move in, out, and around our bodies. So these materials include oxygen, carbon dioxide, food, water, and of course toxins, drugs, hormones, and immune cells. All these materials move in, out, and around our circulation. Now, the cardiovascular system adds convection. What is convection? Convection is movement of molecules of a fluid. Now, here are the features of all circulatory systems, meaning not just humans, but all living organisms. All circulatory systems have blood. Here we see the erythrocytes, or red blood cells, that make up the blood in humans. We have vessels, so we have structures that allow for passageway of blood and other materials. Here we see the red blood cells moving through these vessels. And finally, we have the heart, which is the pumping mechanism that allows for the flow of blood through the vessels throughout the body. Now, the heart is the hardest working organ in your body. The heart is about the size of a fist and weighs 9 ounces. It can generate enough force to circulate blood through the entire body, roughly about 5 liters per minute. The heart beats an average about 72 beats per minute. Clinically, we use a range, so anywhere between 60 to 100 beats per minute is the normal range for an average adult heartbeat. Every minute of every day until you die. Now, this is pretty remarkable. Now, imagine clenching and relaxing your fist 70 times in a minute. After about a few minutes, your fist starts to get pretty tired. So the heart actually acts as a double pump. The first part, pump 1, will pump blood to the lungs, specifically deoxygenated blood. So once blood has returned from the rest of the body, it will return to the right side of the heart, so that this deoxygenated blood can be pumped to the lungs to get reoxygenated. And then from the lungs, the reoxygenated blood will then return to the left side of the heart, where pump 2 will pump this reoxygenated blood back to the body so that this blood can send oxygen to the tissues. If you guys follow this YouTube link down here, it will actually show you a heart that has been taken out and hooked up to a machine before it's transplanted. and you will see the heartbeat and allow for the pumping of blood that is being placed into it through a tube. And you can definitely see the pumping action of a transplanted heart. We know that the heart has 4 chambers. It has 2 receiving chambers superiorly, and then 2 pumping chambers. We know that the heart is divided into right versus left. Now the 2 receiving chambers are called atria. So atria is plural, atrium is singular. Okay, so we have a right atrium and a left atrium. Both chambers receive blood. The right atrium will receive deoxygenated blood from the rest of the body through these very large veins called the superior and inferior vena cava. The heart also has 2 receiving chambers. These are the ventricles. So you have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. Okay, so the right ventricle will take the blood that flows from the right atrium into the ventricle and pump this blood into the pulmonary trunk, which will allow for this blood to travel to the lungs. Again, once the deoxygenated blood coming from the body is reoxygenated in the lungs, it will then return to the left side of the heart. It will enter the left atrium, this receiving chamber here on the left, and blood that has been reoxygenated by the lungs will then travel into the pumping chamber, which is the left ventricle. And from the left ventricle, the ventricle will contract and push blood through the aorta, which is this large artery here, and reoxygenated blood will then travel to the rest of the body, sending oxygenated blood to the tissues. Okay? So we have 2 atria, right and left, so right atrium and left atrium, and 2 ventricles, right and left. So the left side pumps blood to the body, whereas the right side pumps blood to the lungs. Now notice how these sentences are different colors. So we're using red to kind of show you that this is blood that contains oxygen. Okay, so this is oxygenated blood. So the left side of the heart pumps mainly oxygenated blood, whereas the right side, as we can see, this sentence right here is in blue. The right side pumps blood to the lungs because the right side is receiving deoxygenated blood. So deoxygenated blood from the tissues. And it will pump this blood to the lungs where we breathe in oxygen, gas exchange occurs that we talked about before, and this oxygenated blood will then go to the left side of the heart so that this blood can be pumped to the rest of the body, delivering oxygen to the tissues. The heart has structures called valves. So it has 4 valves that act like doorways. These valves keep blood going in the right direction. So we can see on the right side here, the valve that separates the atrium from the ventricle, specifically the right atrium from the right ventricle. So remember, this is still the right side of the heart here, and this is the left side of the heart here. So we have valves that prevent the backflow of blood. So once blood has entered the ventricle, all it can do is go forward, specifically on the right, it can go forward through the pulmonary trunk to the lungs. We don't want a backflow of blood back into the atrium. So we have blood flowing into the atrium, the right atrium, going through the valves into the right ventricle, and then once this ventricle contracts, it can push blood into the pulmonary trunk to go to the right and left lung. Okay, so again, if we want blood to flow in the right direction, we want to make sure that those valves close. Okay, and we have actually valves not only between the the atria and the ventricles, but also on the right, we have a valve here between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. So these valves have specific names, and they're usually named for how many cusps are within the valves as well as the shape of the valves, okay? So we have this valve between the atria and the ventricle. This is called the atrioventricular valve, okay? We also have an atrioventricular valve on the left, and again, these valves do have specific names, but we'll get into that in just a little bit. Just know that these valves are definitely very important to allow for the forward direction of blood. So again, the heart has 4 valves. We have valves between the atria and the ventricles. These are the atrioventricular valves. Now, on the right, this valve is called the tricuspid valve because there are 3 cusps, okay, that make up this valve. And on the left, we have the bicuspid valve. So the bicuspid valve only has 2 cusps. So that is why it's called the bicuspid valve. There's actually another name for the bicuspid valve, and that is the mitral valve, because if you look at the shape of the bicuspid valve, it actually looks like a hat. Now, in olden days, back in the early centuries, popes used to wear a hat called a mitre. So because of the shape of this valve, we can also call it the mitral valve, okay? So we have 2 atrioventricular valves, or 2 valves between the atria and the ventricles. On the right, it's the tricuspid valve. On the left, it's the bicuspid valve. Now, we also have valves between the ventricles and the blood vessels that will carry the blood either to the lungs or to the rest of the body. Now, these are called semilunar valves. They're called semilunar because these cusps look like half moons. So semilunar means half moons. So on the right, the semilunar valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk, this is called the pulmonary semilunar valve, okay? Again, these valves are very important to prevent the backflow of blood, and we want blood to move in the correct direction. So from the right atrium, blood will flow through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk to be pumped to the right and left lung. So on the left, once the blood has left the lungs and is returning back to the heart, it will enter the left atrium, and we have that atrioventricular valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle, and this is called the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve, okay? And then from the left ventricle, blood will then flow through this next valve, which is a semilunar valve, specifically the aortic semilunar valve, because this is the valve between the left ventricle and the aorta, okay? So there are 2 semilunar valves between the heart, ventricles, and the vessels. We have the aortic semilunar valve again between the left ventricle and the aorta. And then on the right, we have the pulmonary valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. And we have 2 atrioventricular valves, or the valves between the atria and the ventricles. We have the tricuspid valve on the right. A way to help you remember is there's an R in tricuspid, or RI in tricuspid, and that will help you remember that it is on the right side. Whereas the bicuspid valve, it is the atrioventricular valve on the left side, also called the mitral valve. Now, if we look at these valves from above, we can see these cusps that make up the valves. Now, heart valves can actually be replaced surgically. Sometimes damage or disease can allow a backflow of blood. This is called regurgitation. The resulting sound is a heart murmur, an extra heart sound. If you ever get to auscultate heart sounds using a stethoscope, normally you'll hear a normal lub-dub. But with the backflow of blood or regurgitation of blood, this will cause an extra heart sound, and this is called a heart murmur. If you ever get a chance, try to YouTube heart murmurs, and you can compare heart murmurs versus normal heart sounds. So we talked about the heart. Now we're going to talk about blood vessels. Blood vessels are basically structures that are highways for blood, and we can see the many different things that are in blood. But what is blood? So let's talk about blood for just a little bit. But as you can see in this model of the human being, we can see many of those pathways that go throughout the body, either transporting rich oxygenated blood to that part of the body, or taking deoxygenated blood and other materials away from that part of the body to go back to the heart. Okay. So what's in blood? We have 55% of whole blood is made up of plasma, and then about 45% of whole blood is made up of cells. So if we kind of place our blood in this tube and then spin it around in a machine called a centrifuge, this is how blood would separate. So about 55% is this clear fluid that we can see, not clear, yellowish straw-colored fluid. This is the plasma, and we can see this thick sediment kind of towards the bottom of the tube. These are the cells that are within the whole blood. So plasma is about 90% water with dissolved substances. And the cells within that 45% include red blood cells. Red blood cells are the cells that contain the protein hemoglobin that will carry oxygen to our tissues. We also have white blood cells. These blood cells, white blood cells, are important for immune responses, or basically how our body fights off infection and other things that cause inflammation within our body. And we also have cells called platelets. Platelets are very important in the formation of clots. So for example, if we have an injury to our skin or one of our blood vessels, these platelets go to the area of injury and kind of form a little clot or band-aid to prevent blood from seeping out of these blood vessels. Now there are three main types of blood vessels. We have arteries, veins, and capillaries, okay? And all are very important for transport of blood, as well as the ability of the blood to transfer gases such as carbon dioxide and oxygen. So which do you think, if we kind of do a cross-section of these blood vessels, which do you think are arteries, veins, and capillaries, and why? So this kind of fits into the theme of form-fitting function, and we'll talk about what these blood vessels do and why they have the structure that they do that kind of helps them perform their specific function. So here in A, we see a blood vessel that has a very thick middle wall, and usually this middle wall has muscles that help push blood along. So A has that thicker middle muscular layer. B doesn't have that thick middle muscular layer, might be even a single layer, and C is just basically one layer, one cell layer that makes up this vessel's wall. So we'll get into the different blood vessels, and you can determine which one represents which blood vessel. So we know that blood vessels come in different sizes. We have vessels that are moving away from the heart or transporting blood away from the heart. These are called arteries. These are the larger blood vessels, and the largest of them all is the aorta. And we know that the aorta is coming directly from the left ventricle. Okay, so blood being pumped from the left ventricle will enter this first very large artery, which is the aorta. Now, all arteries are defined as vessels that transport blood away from the heart. Okay. Arteries will then allow for transport of blood into smaller types of arteries, and these are called arterioles. Okay, so as the blood is being transported to our tissues, these vessels get smaller. And then the smallest of them all are the capillaries, and these are tiny. These are very, very small. It's at this point within the capillary bed that we have our gas exchange. And in order for that to happen, we have to have very small vessels that allow for passage of our gas molecules. Then we have vessels that will return blood to the heart, and these are called veins. So the smallest of them all that kind of are attached to capillaries, these are venules. Okay, these are the smallest of the veins. So once gas exchange has occurred, oxygen has been delivered to the tissues, and then carbon dioxide is then attached to the blood cells. These deoxygenated blood cells will then return to the heart, first starting at the smallest of the veins, which is a venule. The venules will then become larger vessels called veins. And as we can see, the largest vein that we see are the vena cava. There's a inferior vena cava and a superior vena cava that kind of drain blood into the right atrium, that first receiving chamber. The superior vena cava draining blood away from the upper limb and the head neck, whereas the inferior vena cava draining blood from the abdomen and the lower limb. So all this deoxygenated blood being transported back through these large veins into the right side of the heart, and that first chamber being the right atrium. So let's talk about the structure and function of arteries. We know that arteries, with regards to their structure, are very thick-walled and contain 3 specific layers. The innermost layer is the tunica intima. Tunica means layer. So the innermost is the tunica intima. We then have this middle muscular layer, which is the tunica media, and then the outermost layer of the artery is the tunica externa, or also known as the tunica adventitia. Okay, so these are the 3 layers of a typical artery, with this very thick muscular layer, which makes sense because you need that muscular layer to push blood away from the heart and towards the tissues. So from the heart, it has a very long way to go. We know that arteries, starts with an A, carry blood away from the heart. And they carry blood under very high pressure because you need that pressure to push the blood to the rest of the body, to the tissues. So how do you think their structure relates to their function? Again, we need those thick walls to push blood under pressure, to push that blood to the rest of the body as well as the tissues. Here we kind of see a condition known as a cerebral aneurysm. Cerebral meaning it occurs in the brain. Now, an aneurysm is basically this kind of outpouching due to the weakening of the walls of an artery. Now, this is a very serious condition because any bursting of the aneurysm or even clotting can cause a lot of damage. And if we have clotting, this clot can then kind of block an artery going to, a major area of the brain, and this could cause a cerebrovascular accident or a stroke. So any weakening of the walls of the arteries can cause this aneurysm and can cause a lot of damage. So from the arteries, the blood will flow into the arterioles, and arterioles are vessels that help control the flow of blood into the capillaries. So here we see on the left the arterioles, and we actually have these structures called sphincters. Okay, so these are precapillary sphincters that when they relax, they will allow for the oxygenated blood to enter the capillaries. So this is a capillary bed where we can see oxygen entering the capillaries, and what will happen is oxygen will be transported across the lining of the capillaries into the tissues. And from there, any of the waste products, such as carbon dioxide, will then flow into the capillaries, and this is of course where gas exchange occurs, and then from the capillaries it will then flow into the smallest of the veins, which is a venule. Okay, so arterioles are the blood vessels that help control the flow of blood into the capillaries. Again, capillaries are the smallest of the vessels where gas exchange occurs within the tissues. And then from the capillaries, deoxygenated blood and waste products will enter the smallest of the veins, which is a venule. So again, pre-capillary sphincters allow arterioles to adjust blood flow. Here we can see a cross-section of a capillary, and we can see that the capillary actually only has sort of a single cell wall layer, and within this layer there are kind of some pores, or what we call fenestrations, that allow for oxygen and carbon dioxide to kind of leak through. Okay, so oxygen will leak through these capillaries to allow for oxygen to go to the tissue cells, whereas carbon dioxide can then be leaked into the capillaries so that they can be taken away back to the heart. So if we see under a microscope that these capillaries are very thin-walled, and usually they're so small that they only allow for red blood cells to travel in a single file. If you ever get a chance, definitely take a look at blood flow through the tail of a goldfish. So the structure of the capillaries, these are the smallest blood vessels. They're very thin-walled, about 1 cell layer thick. Function is to allow for a selective exchange of substances with the interstitial fluid, or the fluid within the tissues. Again, how does their function relate to their structure? We want to have very thin-walled capillaries to, again, allow for gas exchange and exchange of materials between the capillaries and the tissues of the body. Moving on to veins. The structure of most veins, again, have those 3 layers. However, compared to arteries, they are very thin-walled, but they have a larger lumen. Lumen is basically the diameter within the vein that allows for passageway. It's a space that allows for passageway of the red blood cells and other materials. So here, this space right here, this is the lumen. Okay, I don't draw very well straight lines, but you can see that this is the lumen of the vein. And we can see the 3 different layers. We have the innermost layer, again, that tunica intima, that middle muscular layer, compared to the arteries, is not as large. And then the outer tunica adventitia, or tunica externa. Function of our veins to carry blood toward the heart. Okay. Now, why do you think veins aren't as strong as arteries? Well, basically, veins aren't under the pressure, the same pressure as arteries are. Arteries are under pressure from the left side of the heart to push that blood into the tissues, whereas veins, their job is just to basically transport blood back to the heart, back to the right side of the heart. So they're not under the influence of the direct influence of the pressure from the left side of the heart. So they're not as thick walled compared to arteries. So now that we've gone through the structure and function of the different blood vessels, which of these three, which do you think are veins, arteries, and capillaries, and why? So I'm going to let you guys answer that question, and we'll revisit that during lab. So veins basically defy gravity. They are returning blood to the heart. So we have our structures of the lower limb, for example. Blood is being transported down to as far as the foot. Thankfully, we have structures that allow for blood to flow through the veins back to the heart. We have contraction of skeletal muscles that allow for the deoxygenated blood to travel through the veins up the leg. We also have structures called valves. So we have one-way valves that permit only one-way blood flow. So as we can see, we have valves within the veins that prevent backflow of blood so that blood can move up the lower limb back to the heart. Now, we also have pressure changes that are associated with breathing that also allow for the pushing of blood up the veins back to the heart. We have conditions called varicose veins. This occurs especially when you get older, or people who are more prone to varicose veins includes people that smoke, causing faulty valves. Varicose veins are basically the valves are no longer working, so that the blood kind of backflows through the vein. So guys, take care of your veins. Allow for good circulation. Make sure you're walking around and providing good circulation to your limbs. So let's start talking about the flow of blood through the body. We want to start by learning these very simple steps. So one, blood will flow from the body. Okay, what type of blood is this? We have deoxygenated blood. Basically, this is blood that's being taken away from the tissues, from the body. This deoxygenated blood will then flow to the heart, specifically the right side of the heart. Okay, and we can see these boxes representing the chambers. So deoxygenated blood will flow to the right side of the heart, and from the right side of the heart, it will flow to the lungs. And this represents pump number one. So right side of the heart being pump number one, pumping blood to the lungs, where it can pick up oxygen that we breathe in. So from the lungs, this reoxygenated blood that has picked up oxygen from the lungs will then return back to the heart, specifically the left side of the heart, okay, and through the different chambers of the heart. And this is pump number two. So pump number two on the left side of the heart will then pump this oxygenated blood back to the rest of the body so that the body can receive all this great oxygenated blood. That being said, we can say that the heart participates in double circulation, or two circuits. The first being the pulmonary circuit, specifically blood flow to the lungs. So a circuit between the heart and the lungs. So this is the circuit that represents blood to and from the lungs. Blood picks up oxygen in the lungs and then drops off carbon dioxide. So we breathe in oxygen, and in the pulmonary circuit, within the lungs, gas exchange occurs. The oxygen that we breathe in is picked up by the red blood cells, and then the red blood cells are dropping off carbon dioxide that we exhale and breathe out. So we can see this pulmonary circuit coming from the right side of the heart, going towards the lungs. within the pulmonary circuit, we have gas exchange, and then this reoxygenated blood from the lungs will then return to the left side of the heart. The next circulation we're going to talk about, the circuit we'll talk about, is the systemic circuit, which is the body. So this is blood that transports to and from the rest of the body. Within the tissues of the body, blood drops off oxygen to the body cells and picks up the waste products of metabolism, including carbon dioxide. Okay, so here is that systemic circuit where we have gas exchange, oxygen is dropped off to the tissues of the body, and carbon dioxide is taken away and then taken back to the right side of the heart so that it can once again enter that pulmonary circuit. So as a student of human biology, you should be able to follow the pathway of a single drop of blood through the circulation and through the heart. So let's follow a single drop of blood from the body tissues through the heart. So here we see a typical picture of the heart. Once again, this represents the right side of the heart, and this represents the left side of the heart. So we first start off with blood from the body. Blood from the body will enter these large veins called vena cava. So up here we have the superior vena cava, and then down below we have the inferior vena cava. Blood will then flow into this first retrieving chamber, which is the right atrium. It will then pass through this valve, this atrioventricular valve, also known as the tricuspid valve, and then from the right atrium, blood will flow through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it will then go through this pulmonary valve or the pulmonary semilunar valve to the pulmonary trunk, where it will enter the right and the left lungs. You can see sort of the outline of the right and left lungs. From the right and left lungs, we know that blood will pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. This is the gas exchange that occurs within the pulmonary circuit. Once blood has picked up oxygen, it will then return to the left side of the heart, into the left ventricle. Into the left atrium, and then through the valve, which is the bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle, through the aortic valve, into the aorta, where blood will then flow to the rest of the body, and we enter that systemic circuit with gas exchange occurring, where oxygen is dropped off and carbon dioxide is picked up to return back to the heart. All right, I'm going to stop this video here and then make another video to get into the other learning objectives of this chapter of the cardiovascular system.